Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part B. In sight, in mind, but far away in time. The Untold Stories of Ancient Jerusalem. Chapter 4. The Untold Story of Shishak's campaign and Jerusalem's role in it. It is common to assume that Shishak, king of Egypt, mentioned 7 times in the Hebrew Bible, twice in the first book of Kings and 5 more times in 2 Chronicles, should be identified with King Shishak I, the founder of the 22nd dynasty in Egypt, who probably reigned between 945 and 924 BCE, although scholars debate on it. The military campaign that this king conducted in the land of Israel is considered one of the most important events in biblical history, since it is the earliest historical event described in the Old Testament that is also explicitly mentioned in an extra-biblical source. From the geographical historical perspective, the campaign's importance stems from the many places mentioned in the Egyptian inscription, places that can be identified with the borders of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, can be studied, investigated, excavated, and compare the archaeological finds to the historical information. From the archaeological perspective, since in archaeological excavations it is relatively easy to locate destruction layers and to date them to specific periods, many of these destruction layers have been linked to the Egyptian campaign and were historically explained in that context. This means that the military campaign led by Pharaoh Shishak I and the various sources about it serve as a unique and first of its kind test case that can be used to study, on the one hand, about the nature and quality of the ancient historical sources, and on the other hand, about the nature, quality, and limitations of the archaeological research. The main source of information about Shishak's campaign is the list of places he conquered during the campaign, known as the Shishak inscription or Shishak relief. This list was engraved on one of the walls at the entrance to the Temple of Amun-Re in Karnak, and the names of the places were carved in hieroglyphic script on the bodies of captives who had their hands tied behind their back inside oval frames which symbolize walled cities. All the captives are bound, and the ropes that connect them are held in the hands of the god Amun-Re and of a female figure who embodies No Amun the victorious. Before the image of the god, the image of the king was carved as a ruler striking down the Asians. Despite the difficult problems that researchers faced in understanding the order of the places mentioned in the list, it is now accepted that the places within the borders of the land of Israel were written according to geographical regions, mentioning the northern lowland and the hill country to the east of it, the Jordan Valley, the Beit Shean Valley, the Jezreel Valley, the Sharon region, Nahal Iron, Wadi Ara, and the central part of the Samaria Hills, the southern part of Mount Ephraim. Analysis of the list reveals that most of the places are located along the main route that led from the northern lowlands towards the Jezreel Valley. Thus, it appears that the Egyptian campaign's main destination was the northern kingdom of Israel, only a short time after it was established. And it seemed that the Egyptian army also operated in the south of Mount Ephraim and in the west of the region of Benjamin, in the Beit Shean and the Jordan valleys, up to the Yabok River area. ever since Martin North's pioneering study, published already in 1938, many researchers accepted the assumption that the main force of the Egyptian army arrived at Megiddo, and from there, smaller army units were sent towards the Beit She'an and the Jordan valleys. A fragment of a large Egyptian stele, inscribed with the royal name of King Shishak I, found in excavation at Megiddo, supports the centrality of this site to the Egyptian campaign. Still, on the way from Egypt, probably while the Egyptian army was in the area of Gaza, a task force was sent to the Negev, and on the way to Megiddo, another force went up to the center of the central hill country on the Bet Horon route. Beside their journeys up to the West Benjamin area and south of Mount Ephraim, it seemed that the Egyptian army avoided going up to the central hill country. From the route of the campaign, it seems that the Egyptians surrounded Judah, which was not one of the campaign's targets. Shishak campaign is also mentioned in two biblical sources. In the first book of Kings, chapter 14, verses 25 to 28, and in 1 Chronicles, chapter 12, verses 2 to 12. Since most scholars assume that the author of the book of Chronicles didn't have any information about the reality in Judah during the days of Rehoboam, hundreds of years before his time, it seems that this story should not be accepted and treated as reliable information. The authors of Chronicles used the information from the book of Kings, expanded and adapted it to the historical picture they were creating regarding the great and powerful kingdom of David and Solomon, as well as to their own concept of reward, which was different from the Deuteronomistic concept as implemented in the historiographical descriptions of the Book of Kings. The story in the Book of Kings is short and concise, and actually contains almost no information about the Egyptian campaign except for its date, which may even be quite accurate, and the name of the Egyptian king, whose spelling in Ketib Shishak and in Keri Shishak is very close to the Egyptian name of the pharaoh. The description of Shishak's campaign comes after the quite standard Deuteronomistic opening formula in the first book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 21, in which Rehoboam is introduced, his age and the length of his reign over Judah are specified, and the name of his mother, Naamah the Ammonite, is given, and I'm quoting. Now, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which Yahweh had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite. End of quote. The special addition in this opening formula is the definition that is added to Jerusalem, the city which Yahweh had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. In contrast to the usual Deuteronomistic phrase, the place which God had chosen, the change made here to the city which God has chosen is unique to four occurrences in the Hebrew Bible, the connection between which indicates the author's tendency. In the first book of Kings, chapter 8, verse 16, at the time of the dedication of the temple, it is written that, and I'm quoting, "Since the day that I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I chosen no city in all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house that my name might be there." Adding to this, in the first book of Kings, chapter 11, verse 32, as part of the prophecy about the division of the kingdom, it is written that, "But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel." The description in our story in the first book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 21, about the days of Rehoboam, the first king to rule after the division of the kingdom, and the one in whose time the prophecy about the division was fulfilled, is the third occurrences of the notion of the city that God has chosen. Finally, the last occurrence of this expression appears in the second book of Kings, chapter 21, verse 7, in the description of Manasseh's sins that led to the destruction, where it is written, I'm quoting, "And the graven image of Asherah that he had made, he set in the house of which Yahweh said to David and Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever." End of quote. In other words, this is a Deuteronomistic expression that was inserted at key points in the history of Jerusalem, connecting the dedication of the temple, the division of the monarchy, the days of Rehoboam after the division, and the days of Manasseh that led to the destruction. It can be assumed that the Deuteronomistic author added this phrase at these key points, wanting to emphasize the preference of Jerusalem over the other cult centers that operated in Israel after the division of the monarchy. It is possible that a late editor who edited and wrote after the destruction of Jerusalem added this term to the description of the days of Manasseh as part of the explanations for the destruction itself. Coming back to Rehoboam. Immediately after this opening formula comes, as usual regarding all the Deuteronomistic description of the Judean kings, a theological evaluation formula of the king. And I'm reading from the first book of Kings, chapter 14, verses 20 to 24, which is unusual in its harshness, in contrast to the usual formula, which accuses the kings of Judah who did evil in the eyes of God. This formula accuses the people of Judah of cultic and religious sins. I'm quoting, "And Judah did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins which they committed, more than all that their fathers had done. For they also built for themselves high places and pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also male cult prostitutes in the land, that did according to all the abominations of the nations which Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel." End of quote. The phrase, "and Judah did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh," is unique. And since in other places it is written in the singular, "and he did," indicating the king's clear blame. The meaning here is that the guilt of Judah and not of the king who had just come to reign. Perhaps this is also connected to the punishment that follows on Judah, which is also a punishment for Judah and not for the king, who did the right thing when he surrendered to Shishak and saved Judah from destruction. The other phrases that appear in the verse of the theological evaluation formula also characterize the Deuteronomistic text and are related to the historiographical and theological point of view of the Deuteronomistic authors. From the reading sequence of the description, it appears that the Shishak military campaign is the punishment that came upon Judah and Jerusalem due to the cultic sins they had committed. And I can read from first book of Kings, chapter 14, verses 25 to 28. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the shields of gold which Solomon had made, and King Rehoboam made in their stead shields of bronze and committed them to the hands of the captains of the guard, who kept the door of the king's house. And as often as the king went into the house of Yahweh, the guard bore them and brought them back to the guard room. End of quote. The meaning of the text is not clear, since in the biblical language the phrase came up, in Hebrew ala al, means came towards or went against, and it doesn't necessarily refer to a war. In cases of war, a phrase that defines the war more clearly, like vayatzar, besiege it, or vayitpesem, capture them, always appears later in the sentence, while here the added verb is took away, vayikach. That is in contrast to the parallel descriptions of war, such as in the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 9. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. Or in the same chapter in verse 13, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Here, the purpose of the campaign is unclear. Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. He took away. Does the description here include a war between Shishak and Rehoboam? Was there an Egyptian campaign that reached Jerusalem? The Egyptian sources indicate that Shishak's army didn't approach Judah. Here too, it seems that the authors of the historical description didn't possess any clear information about such a war that did or did not take place over Jerusalem. The only description of Shishak's actions is in verse 26. He took away the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. There is no previous information about the treasures of the king's house, but the treasures of the temple are already known from the first book of Kings, chapter 7, verse 51, which states that after the completion of the construction of the temple, and I'm quoting, all the work that King Solomon did on the house of Yahweh was finished. And Solomon brought in the things which David, his father, had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of Yahweh. A comparison of Rehoboam's policy with the policy of the kings of Judah who came after him indicates that in every case in which great and powerful kings came up on Judah, the kings of Judah used the treasures of the temple and the treasures of the palace and sent them to these kings so that they would help them or so that they would not rise against them. According to the first book of Kings, chapter 15, verses 18 to 19, shortly after Rehoboam, King Asa of Judah, also behaved this way. I'm quoting. Then Asa took all the silver and the gold that were left, pay attention, were left, in the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house, and delivered them into the hand of his servants. And King Asa sent them to Ben-Hadad, the son of Tabrimon, the son of Hezion, king of Aram, who dwelt in Damascus. The emphasis in this description is on all the silver and the gold that were left in the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house. And the separation between the two different sources of the silver and the gold hints at the connection to the days of Rehoboam and what was left of these treasures, since in the description of the days of Rehoboam, it is said that he took everything. According to the second book of Kings, chapter 12, verse 19, Jehoash, king of Judah, did likewise as did Ahaz, and according to chapter 16, verse 7. According to chapter 14, verse 14, Amaziah also did the same, but only after Joash, king of Israel, defeated him and destroyed a large section of the wall of Jerusalem. Hezekiah as well, who usually didn't act according to this policy and rebelled against the king of Assyria, was ultimately forced to give away everything he had and more. And I'm quoting from 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 18, verses 15 to 16. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of Yahweh and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of Yahweh and from the doorpost which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. End of quote. After the destruction of Jerusalem, the king of Babylon also took what was left, and according to the 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 24, verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar had carried off all the treasures of the house of Yahweh and all the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of Yahweh, which Solomon, king of Israel, had made, as Yahweh had foretold. End of quote. Thus, even in the description on the days of Rehoboam in the 1st Book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 26, according to which he took away the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasure of the king's house, he took away everything, the Deuteronomistic historiographers used the usual formula that they used in all the cases in which they described the actions of the king of Judah when they used the treasures of the temple and the king's house to pay the great and powerful kings who came up against them. The only unusual detail in this story, which take up 2.5 verses out of the 4 verses that describes Shishak's campaign, chapter 14, verses 25, 26, 27, and 28, is the special detailed description of the shields. I'm quoting again. He also took away all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. And King Rehoboam made in their stead shields of bronze, and committed them to the hands of the officers of the guard, who kept the door of the king's house. And as often as the king went into the house of Yahweh, the guard bore them and brought them back to the guard room. The information given about these shields, which apparently were used as sign or ritual objects that were carried before the kings of Judah, is that they were made in the days of Solomon. According to the 1st Book of Kings, chapter 10, verses 16 and 17, King Solomon made shields. I'm quoting, King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold. 3 minas of gold went into each shield. And the king put them in a house of the forest of Lebanon. End of quote. These are the golden shields that, according to the description on the days of Rehoboam, Shishak literally took from Jerusalem. The description adds to this that Rehoboam later made replacement shields out of cheap metal. And King Rehoboam made in their stead shields of bronze, and committed them to the hands of the captains of the guard, who kept the doors of the king's house. And as often as the king went into the house of Yahweh, the guard bore them and brought them back to the guard room. According to this description, the officers of the guard, apparently the king's royal guard, carried these shields before the king of Judah whenever these kings left the palace and headed toward the temple. As soon as the king arrived at the palace, the guard returned the shields to their permanent storage place in the guard room at the palace, and were under the supervision of the captains of the guard who kept the doors of the king's house. My assumption is that everyone who lived in Jerusalem or visited Jerusalem witnessed the rituals performed before the kings of Judah as they walked from the palace to the temple, and also saw the captains of the guard who returned these shields to their place. Every child in Jerusalem knew these shields. Every visitor could see them. as they were a familiar and well-known object that was always carried by the captains of the guard before the king. In my opinion, the bronze shields were the memory bearers for Shishak's campaign, and the entire memory of the campaign was rooted in these shields and in the understanding that these were the replacement shields that Rehoboam had made after Shishak took the gold shields created by Solomon. This information was passed down through the centuries from father to son, and in my opinion it was the only source of information about Shishak's campaign, including the date, preserved in memory, the 5th year of Rehoboam. Everything was rooted in these known shields. Around the nucleus of this memory of the taking of the shields, the looting was extended into a kind of include all the treasures of the temple, of the palace, as part of the usual description of what the kings of Judah did whenever great and powerful kings came up against them. This leaves open the possible explanation of Egyptian campaign against Judah. However, there is no record of such a campaign elsewhere. Therefore, its description is cautious and limited to the text paid and the shields taken without giving any other details. The Egyptian campaign was understood by the Deuteronomistic historiographers as God's punishment of Judah for their sins, and was thus incorporated into the description. This is also the reason why the historiographers didn't know at all that the main destination of the campaign was the kingdom of Israel and not the kingdom of Judah, and provided no additional detail or any information about the campaign's course, purpose, and results. I find it difficult to accept scholarly suggestions regarding a chronicle that preserved the details of the Egyptian campaign, since, as mentioned, there is no real information about such a military campaign in any biblical description, beyond the usual Deuteronomistic formulas that formed around the memory of the taking of the golden shields made by Solomon and the creation of the bronze replacement shields by Rehoboam. This is also the only piece of information that is told about the days of Rehoboam. There is not a single detail of additional information about his days, and the description of his history ends with an almost completely normal concluding formula, according to which in verse 29 to 31, now the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all their days. And Rehoboam slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite, and Abiam, his son, reigned in his stead. In my opinion, this is another example of objects, buildings, and places that carried ancient memories and served as the source of information about the ancient period in the history of Jerusalem, regarding which the Deuteronomistic authors had no other source of information. As we will see in the next chapter, there was no real information about the history of the temple either, and memory-bearing objects such as the altar made by Solomon next to the new altar made in the days of King Ahaz, or the chest into which the pilgrims put the silver and the gold collected for the renovation of the temple, also in this case comprised the only source of information available to Deuteronomistic historiographers. This will be the subject of the next chapter.